All right, I'm here at an MMA Dispute interview lounge with Mike Chiappetta. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great, thanks, my man.
All right, Mike. Question number one is: how did you develop into the MMA scene, covering fighters and news?
Well, that's kind of an interesting story. I mean, I have a mainstream sports background. I have a newspaper background, worked covering all kinds of sports from high school stuff to pro sports years ago, and then I kind of transitioned into working in publications for magazines and things like that. And I sort of left, writing about sports behind. I was more on the editorial side, but a couple of years ago, I got a call from an old boss of mine who was going to NBC Sports, and he was kind of helping them start up their new website. They didn't have a website till 2006, and he asked me to come work for him. And I told him I really wasn't that interested because I didn't like the direction that sports coverage was going, and it's just a really tough market out there, and I just wasn't really too interested. But I told them I'd think about it for a bit, and I'd been an MMA fan for a long time, and I really felt like the sport was primed to explode, and I really didn't think that the coverage of the sport was very good. So I thought there was a good opportunity there for me to kind of carve my own niche and be, get out there before anybody else. And so I got back to him and I told him, I'd be willing to come join him at NBC Sports if he was willing to give me the opportunity to write about MMA. And he was open to it, so I went to NBC Sports and I started writing about MMA there. And here we are years later, and I'm still doing it. And I'm glad to say I was right. The sport is growing, blowing up, and I think it's still going to get bigger from here.
Gotcha, gotcha. Speaking of MMA, what is your opinion of MMA in regard to the national spotlight and the media coverage they're getting?
I think it still needs a lot of work. I think it's gotten better. I mean, when I started at NBC, there was not one single sports site had an MMA page, had an MMA section. We were actually the first ones at NBC Sports to have a fully devoted section for MMA. So, and that was in 2006. Now pretty much all the major sites have one, but a lot of them don't do a whole lot with it. A lot of them have content partnerships with other smaller sites that kind of author all their content. They don't put a whole lot of resources behind it. I think that's the next thing that needs to happen. ESPN doesn't have a devoted MMA writer, and CBS Sports doesn't have a devoted MMA writer, and I think that at this point there's really not an excuse for that because the sport is big enough to demand it. Especially if you're a site that has a boxing writer, at this point MMA is much bigger than boxing by pretty much any measurable. So to me, that's what I'd like to see. Also, I live in the tri-state area, in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, and it was pretty frustrating for me to see that the New York Daily News, which is one of the biggest newspapers around here, had absolutely no coverage of UFC 111. And Newark, New Jersey is about 10, 12 miles from from New York City. I'm sorry, they're only 12 miles away from each other, and that's a huge local event, and there's no reason for them to ignore it, yet they do. So there's still sort of that um, built-in ignorance and just built-in lack of interest in MMA. I think it's mostly due to just having a lot of older people in these positions of power who still are not interested in the sport. But as there's more turnover and younger people start taking those positions, I think that stuff's all going to change. It's just a matter of time.
Gotcha, gotcha. And speaking of writers, there's plenty of writers out there doing blogs, including myself. But you're looked at as one of the main people to go through for news interviews. Why do people go through you for like good interviews and news?
Well, I think the thing is, like I said before, when I first started writing about MMA, there just wasn't too many people who were writing about the sport and covering it as though it was a professional sport. I think a lot of people that were writing about it were fans and just people who didn't have much of a journalistic background. And there's nothing really wrong with that. Those people have kind of helped keep the sport alive when no one else was doing it. One of the reasons there aren't a lot of trained journalists writing about MMA is because it's a very tough way to make a living. There just aren't too many jobs for people like that, for people like that are interested in it. But I always kind of came at it with the belief I'm going to write about this sport just as I would if I was writing about the NFL or Major League Baseball or whatever the case may be. I want to treat it professionally. I want to treat the athletes professionally, and I want to, if they need to be criticized for something, I'll do that. If they need to be, praised for something that they did, I'll do that as well. But just to kind of treat the sport even-handedly, and I think people respond to that because it wasn't something that was around. I think when I first started writing, among the major sports sites, it was only myself and Dave Doyle, who at the time was at Fox Sports, and he would write about MMA from time to time before he went to Yahoo. But we were really the two of the only guys who were at major sports sites who were writing about MMA and treating it as though it was a major professional sport. And I think that reputation has carried with me, and I think I always try and keep that in mind. That the guys who are in the sport, who are competing, are they're just normal people who are trying to make a good life for themselves and their families, and this is the way they choose to do it. And this sport is sanctioned and regulated, so there's no reason that they should be, ridiculed by mainstream media or ignored or anything else. I mean, they should be treated like any other professional athlete, and that's what I always aim to do.